Our readings this morning remind us that we'll soon be heading into Advent. There's a great foreboding in the readings, which is so characteristic of the Advent season. Malachi the prophet in our first reading announces, "See, the day is coming, burning like an oven." And Jesus in the gospel reading points to the huge temple that he was walking past with his disciples. And he says, "As for these things you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another." And I want to focus this morning on how the disciples responded to Jesus saying that. Jesus says, the temple you're looking at will be destroyed. And the disciples respond by saying, when will this be? What are the signs it's about to happen? How will we know? They want to pin Jesus down. Will this happen soon, Jesus? Are we talking days, weeks, months? They wanted to know. They wanted certainty. We all want certainty. None of us enjoy not knowing. In the midst of all the chaos in the world, in our lives, we want to know the solid ground on which we can stand. When will this be? We've all asked that question. And notice how Jesus doesn't actually answer the disciples' question. They ask it, but he goes on instead and tell them to beware that they won't be led astray. And this non-answer is very characteristic of Jesus. He says elsewhere in answer to a similar question from the disciples, he says this, "No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, not the Son, but only the Father." From which I can deduce that if there are things that Jesus himself doesn't know, then there's going to be plenty of things that I will never know. So we need to learn to embrace uncertainty, unknowing. As our own Jonas Salk said, to await certainty is to await eternity. Brené Brown said, "I spent a lot of years trying to outrun or outsmart vulnerability by making things certain and definite, black and white, good and bad. My inability to lean into the discomfort of vulnerability limited the fullness of those important experiences that are wrought with uncertainty. Love, belonging, trust, joy, and creativity, to name a few." And I'm sure that I'm not the only person here who can identify with that statement. I'm still learning that I need to embrace uncertainty, that I don't need to be afraid of it. It's only when we give up trying to control things, to make things certain, that we can enter into the vulnerability in which faith is nurtured. The great truth is the only thing we can be certain about is the existence of uncertainty. And I say that knowing that it's very hard to live with uncertainty. I've learnt that over the years in going to see people in hospital. That I often go and see people who've been told they have a very serious illness. And I've noticed that they tend sometimes, if not often, to be in a better mental state than those people who are in the hospital having tests to find out whether they've got a serious illness. It would appear that it's easier to know something bad than to live in a state of not knowing something bad. The disciples looked at the temple and saw this big, bright, bold symbol of God's presence, the biggest they could imagine. The glitz of the temple spoke to them of religious certainty and permanence. Jesus looked at the temple and saw something completely different. He saw fragility, not permanence, loss, not glory, change, not stasis. Jesus saw that everything must break and buckle at the end before new life and new hope can emerge. Jesus saw the necessity of death before the possibility of resurrection. And Jesus is inviting the disciples to look beyond the grandeur of the temple and recognize that God cannot be contained or domesticated, even in that fabulous structure. God exceeds every edifice, every institution, every symbol that has ever been created in his name. God is always beyond our expectations, our knowledge, our certainties. Barbara Brown argues that disillusionment is essential to the Christian life. She says, disillusionment is literally the loss of an illusion about ourselves, about the world, about God. And while it is almost always a painful thing, it is never a bad thing to lose the lies that we have mistaken for the truth. The disciples would have been disillusioned to hear about the loss of the great temple. And we too need to embrace on our spiritual journey the fact that it will include doubt, rubble, ruin, failure, and disillusionment. Because only God is constant. Everything else will eventually disappoint and fade away. The only certain thing in life is uncertainty. But amidst all the chaos and uncertainty, God is God, God is steadfast, God is working his purposes out. And we need to expand our vision to embrace that glorious truth. We need to expand our vision beyond the endless news cycles of doom and see a bigger picture, tell a bigger story, a story about a God who created the world, who has acted in love to redeem the world, and will one day act again to restore his creation. That's the context in which we should understand all the talk of wars and insurrections. That's why Jesus can say to the disciples, do not be terrified. That's why as people of faith, we can say with Mother Julian of Norwich, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And such a statement is not fantasy. It's not escapism. Our fears are real. There's plenty of things in our world to be fearful of. But we believe that evil and sin, the forces of death and destruction, will not have the final word. We are a people of hope. We are a people of faith. We are people who believe in the God of love. We believe contrary to what the world believes, contrary to how things might appear, that God is working his purposes out. And we can be certain of that. God is the only place where we can look for certainty. And I have a final word, a PS, which comes from today's epistle to the Thessalonians. St. Paul ends that reading with these words, do not be weary of doing what is right. This is the second letter that Paul has written to the church in Thessalonica. His first epistle was the first and oldest writing we have of his. It's the earliest piece of writing in the New Testament. And Paul perhaps overstates his case in that letter, that the kingdom was about to come, that letter is all about the day is near. And he might have overdone it, because the Thessalonians read it and reacted by giving up. They thought, well, if the kingdom's coming soon, if the end is near, let's just sit back and watch God do his thing. So they'd become idle. They'd given up. So Paul writes again to say, okay, I might have slightly overstated things in my first letter. He writes again to remind them to stay engaged, not to be idle, not to give up, but to stay engaged. And that's a message for us too in the midst of all the confusion and the uncertainty. Stay engaged with this confusing and uncertain world. Do not be weary in doing what is right. Amen.